In this video, I want to provide you some initial background information about food security trends so that we have a clear idea about how food security is measured, what are some of the basic drivers for food insecurity, and how the world differs quite dramatically. In some parts of the world that has more food than the people need versus others that don't have enough. And it connects to the Sustainable Development Goals, the successor international statement of development priorities from 2015 to 2030. The first Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015 tried to have world hunger around the world. The Sustainable Development Goals, the very second goal is moving towards zero hunger, where there is no lack of food security for anyone around the world, which is a much more dramatic goal from having the current number of people without enough food to eat to making zero hunger the goal. And there are a number of different organizations that gather information about food security and food availability, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, an international organization that collects information about that, the UN Development Program, even the Economist Intelligence Unit generates an index on food availability. So in this section, I try to survey the most influential or most commonly used statistics to give us a better understanding of food security and insecurity around the world. So let's start with the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF, and other organizations produce the annual State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. It's an annual report that I've been reading for the last 6 or 7 years since I've been teaching this class, and it provides a really useful breakdown on food insecurity and other characteristics of food availability around the world. And here are a couple of figures that I find particularly interesting and compelling, showing how the number of people, undernourished people in the world, have been expected to rise due to the recent COVID pandemic. And in 2020, the most recent year's reports data that are available suggests that roughly 750 million people faced hunger in 2020. While overall, in the previous 10 or 15 years beforehand, those trends were trending downwards or stayed flat. Given the COVID pandemic and the increased prices, the estimates are that those numbers are going to creep up temporarily before turning around a couple of years after that. And I think it's important to stress when dealing with the most vulnerable around the world that there is kind of not equal but important challenges of both undernourishment and overnourishment, that countries like the United States can have people who are both underweight and people who are not getting enough food to eat because of distribution or economic shortfalls, but then also you can have people who are overweight. Almost 39 million people were overweight in 2020, children, but 150 million children, much more than those who are overweight, are actually underweight to the point that their growth is hampered through stunting. The reversals in the decrease in food security is usually in areas that are affected by conflict and in areas of natural disasters, which is consistent with what we've seen in previous terms. And with the case studies that I'm focusing on today in the Sahel and in Eastern Africa, I want to stress that this is not the area that actually does have the most people that are affected by hunger. Asia has a much larger absolute number of people that are undernourished. 418 million people in Asia as of 2020, while Africa has 282 million people. And then you do have much smaller, 3 million people in Oceania. And who these people are is predictable in a couple of different ways, in which you have across every region, food insecurity is higher amongst women than in men. and that also this is shaped by conflict. This graph shows from one of the previous reports that countries that have conflict are much more likely to have undernourishment, which makes sense because conflict can disrupt normal flows of foodstuffs to markets, or if you're actually producing the food that you eat, if you're driven off your land or if you're killed, you're not exactly able to have a stable enough life to get the food that you actually need. This also ties in the inequality between men and women, but also with children. Conflict has a dramatic effect on the stunting of children because of insufficient food, which is just heartbreaking to think that in 2022, as we've talked about in a previous week, Amartya Sen says that there's enough food around the world for there not to be any famines. It's more of a distribution and a political issue than a pure availability issue. And there have been a whole bunch of different drivers for why this is the case. We're going to get into that in the next video. But even these reports by the FAO and other international organizations connects directly to the themes of this class. In their yearly reports, they have a special area of interest. In 2017, it was conflict, showing how conflict increased food insecurity. So it's important to think, for this class's purposes, how the relationship can be endogenous, that food insecurity can lead to conflict, but conflict, of course, also leads to food insecurity. We're going to talk more about that in the workshop. Climate change and climate variability was the subject of the 2018 report. Economic downturns in 2019, and how hard it is to actually afford a healthy diet in the 2020 report, which is something that I unfortunately saw firsthand in some parts of the United States that I lived in. New York as well as in Louisiana. They have what's called food deserts. In certain areas of urban cities that don't have the markets and the places to buy or get healthy food, that often it is more processed food that are available in poor areas. And this is a challenge in both developed and developing countries to try to get healthy diets in a way that is feasible for any budget. We mentioned Venezuela a couple of years ago. That also played into one of the earlier FAO reports that shows this quite dramatic increase in undernourishment from the 2012 to 2014 period, which connects to the discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago because of the political decisions related to dependence on oil production and oil revenue depending on oil prices, as well as the political leadership crisis and challenge at the federal level. So FAO had their report. There's others that you could look at if you're interested. And this is also connecting to the fact that almost every topic that students are likely to focus on in our classes, there's both academic research that we cover in our classes, but then there's also more direct policy relevant reports and information gathering by international organizations or nonprofit or news gathering organizations that provide more detailed descriptions of case studies and data on different issues, including food security. So in the 2021 Food Security Index, you can see the regional distribution of food insecurity can vary quite dramatically. In global northern countries like Canada, the US, Northern Europe, people are relatively food secure. Ireland ranked number 1 last year. Australia was 32nd, and New Zealand was 16th for food security. Contrast that with those at the bottom of the scale. You have Burundi, Yemen, Mozambique, Sudan, Malawi, Ethiopia. So the bottom 5, except for Yemen, are in sub-Saharan Africa. Yemen, also a country that's in current conflict, that shaped, of course, their food security. And these different measures are aggregate measures of different indices. The methodology section of this report I geeked out on for a while and thought about how I could use this for my own research. They look at affordability, availability, the quality and safety of food, as well as how resilient they are to natural disasters and the provision of natural resources. And I think this report also links to how we conduct our research and ask questions about how the world works. So just getting to the report, they also have a research question: how food secure is a country? And they distill the many different ways to conceptualize it into several themes, which connects to the literature reviews and the research proposals for this class as a way to kind of show you that it's not just what we're doing in this class, it's a broader way of using the scientific method to understand the world. Other reports connect food security to other factors that we've covered in this class, including democracy. The Economist Intelligence Unit from one of their earlier reports looked at how food affordability and food security is related to democracy, and in a kind of one directional way. There's no observed U or inverted U shape here, that basically as a country becomes more democratic, the affordability as well as the security levels go up, which is a pretty remarkable institutional kind of factor that connects to Amartya Sen's argument that it is not about pure availability of food, it is more a political institution and institutional limitations to where resources are within the global food market. A couple of takeaways going back to the Global Food Security Index. 70 countries during the initial part of the COVID-19 pandemic saw scores for food security decline rather than improve because of rising prices, and most of the countries that were food secure were coastal countries, which plays into that environmental, geographical arguments for a lot of the outcomes we look at in this class, that if countries have easier transport to export their own goods and bring other goods in, you're more likely to be able to have enough for everybody to go around. And of course, political instability it makes food insecurity more likely to be worse within countries, which is the inverse of that democracy leads to food insecurity, that political instability or lack of accountability for the government increases the chance of food security. Another thing is that links to political institutions is policies relating to tariffs. This graph is a couple of years old now, but linking to agricultural tariffs, there is a wide variety of countries' policies in making them more or less open to imports of agricultural goods, either to protect their own domestic market. In one of my other classes, I talk about how the U.S. government for a while paid Brazilian farmers because the U.S. lost a case in the World Trade Organization because the U.S. was providing subsidies to their farmers to the extent that other countries thought that that was making their farmers not competitive, their products not competitive. The U.S. found it politically expedient to send billions of dollars to Brazilian farmers as opposed to reduce their tariffs around the world. You see Sudan as one of the countries with the highest tariff rates of 30%. Australia is quite low at 1.2%. India 33%, Turkey 42%. So you see a wide variety of countries' interests in trying to protect their own domestic production versus trying to incorporate their production into the rest of the world, as well as to connect it to the climate themes that we've covered in this class. The nature of where crops are being produced in different countries has also changed quite dramatically. In the Vesco et al. Article that we read for this week, we've seen how crop production has been concentrated in certain developing countries and how that could exacerbate conflict. But even in Australia, between 1990 and 2015, Australia's wheat belt has also shrunk quite dramatically. Let's see if I can get this to play over time. Yeah, between 1990 and 2015, it's quite dramatic, the shrinkage in the areas that can produce wheat within Australia. This is from 2015 now. It's the most recent year I can get. But it does link to the literature that we read for this week, that where crops are being produced can change, Going back in week 3, I showed how Canadian and British wines were becoming I still prefer New Zealand wines, and Australian, of course, but how production of certain commodities is shifting as the climate changes. In Australia, where you can grow wheat, has declined, but that also has an effect on developing countries for where it is possible to produce goods, at least in areas that don't have irrigation. But even in Australia, where we do have the capacity for irrigation, where wheat is possible to be grown has changed. And then, of course, if you shift to talking about countries that do have conflict, connecting to the Global Security Index report, you see even regional variation in Australia, but then also in war-torn countries like Afghanistan, political instability in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. You do have varied nature in food security within countries, that you have some places that are relatively food secure and others that are much more insecure. Connecting it to natural disasters, things we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks, you do have climate-related shocks like El Nino, droughts, connecting to the Syrian case that we talked about last week, that you do have climate-related shocks that can make food production less dependable, which can create that scarcity, connecting to the Homer-Dixon arguments that we've seen so far in this class. And then you can also see quite dramatic relations between food prices and protests, connecting to the slide that I showed earlier, that when times get tough, when people's resources become harder to get, you're more likely to see the people more likely to hit the streets, which connects to the Van Weezel article that we read for this week, in which you see quite a dramatic connection between food production, food prices, and political instability. So I think there's a few generic trends you can take away from this brief discussion of food insecurity around the world and its connections to genders, to regions, and to conflict and climate. That food security is clearly seen as an international priority. Both scarcity and overabundance are issues in even sometimes within the same country, like in the US, but then also in different regions around the world. Conflict is pretty strongly related to increased food insecurity, while political institutions that are stable and more democratic are associated with dramatic decreases in food insecurity. Women and children are systematically more insecure than men. Climate shocks can lead to food crises, especially because agriculture is one of those industries that are the most dependent on the weather and long-term climate trends and short-term weather variation. It could lead to unanticipated and increasingly anticipated challenges in food insecurity provision, and that price shocks can lead to protest because of the direct effect that it has on people who are limited in their purchasing power to be able to buy the things that they need for themselves and for their families. And connecting to last week's lecture question that I had, really enjoyed your responses in connecting water sourcing and water availability in your lives. So this week I'd like to get your take on how price sensitive you are in your food purchasing decisions, and did you notice in the last couple of years any price fluctuations or availability constraints during the pandemic? I guess toilet paper wouldn't really be considered a foodstuff, but other goods were seen as being more expensive or difficult to get, rationing in Kohl's and Woolworths over the last couple of years. I'd be interested to see if you noticed anything more directly tied to your lives. For those students in my class, please leave your responses in the Waddle lecture question in the appropriate section. And if any of you aren't in my class but would like to provide your feedback, I'd be really interested to see. I know I get a lot of viewers from a whole bunch of different parts of the world that I really never expected to. I think that's great. I'd be interested to hear your personal takes in the comments below. And with that, that kind of summarizes some initial food security trends. Next section, I want to talk more theoretically about the connections between food availability and price and human security and conflict, both from a theoretical lens in the readings that we had in this week, as well as some of the initial path diagrams that these reports from international organizations also have produced as well. So let's go ahead and turn to that now.